We'll make a start. So I'd just like to say welcome more formally. I am Georgina Robinson and I'm the Secretary of ASDS, which is hosting today's session. And on screen, you can see some of the benefits of becoming a member of ASDS and also ways to get in touch with us. If you are interested in participating in a webinar yourself, then please do get in touch with me in the first instance. I can put my email address in the chat, and also keep an eye out on ASDS's social media and the deadlines email, because we're going to be relaunching a form which you can fill in to do that. So I'm going to stop sharing the screens so that I can see what's going on a little bit better. But I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Susan Srigley with us this evening, joining us. Well, it's the middle of the day for you, Susan, isn't it? Joining us all the way from Canada. And I think that is one of the beauties of ASDS, that we have this international community coming together virtually. But hopefully in the next EDD, we can all be together. So Susan, as I say, I'm delighted that you're with us, and I'm really excited to hear what you've got to share with us today from a very long career in deaf studies. So in the first instance, I'd just like to ask, could you please just tell us a little bit about yourself, your academic career, and how you came to be a deaf studies researcher?
Of course. I'll give you the short version because it can be a bit of a long story, as these stories often are. So my background is actually religious studies. So all of my degrees are in religious studies here in Canada. And it's not uncommon, at least in religious studies departments here, to have courses in death, dying, and spirituality, or various versions of a death course, usually just one in a department. And so that's sort of the short route in terms of how I started teaching, or why the connection between religious studies and death studies for me. But my original area of research is actually ethics and literature, and so within religious studies, and the primary focus of my PhD and subsequent research has been on the American novelist Flannery O'Connor, Catholic in the American South. And so that has been, sort of part of my research work and my writing. But, when you're teaching, you can end up teaching everything. And so I teach very little Flannery O'Connor, and I teach a lot of different things in relation to religious studies, world religions, spiritual journeys, history of Christian thought, things like that. But the first course that I taught was a course called Death and Immortality when I got my job here at Nipissing University, where I am now. And, I had never taught the course before. I hadn't even TA'd it as a graduate student, so it was all new to me. And I dove in, and it was a really interesting experience for me to see the ways in which the students responded to that course. I had, probably about 50 students. It's a second-year course in the undergraduate program. And there just seemed to be an incredible desire to talk about these things. And the more I read and the more I studied, the more I realized that there are very few places in our society where we can talk about death. And so what I was experiencing with my students was this longing for a safe space to have conversations about the things that they're wondering about and asking, in their young, emerging, adulthood. And they were finding it here. And so that ended up being, sort of the beginning of that journey. But at the same time, as I was teaching these courses, I had also experienced, a fairly traumatic death, the death of my father, who was quite young when he died, and he died at home, and my family cared for him. And then that led me to do the training to become a palliative care volunteer. So here in Canada, we have we're sort of called something like, it's sort of like a traveling hospice, in the sense that we are volunteers who go to people where they're at, whether it's in their homes, hospitals, long-term care facilities, wherever they might be, to accompany them, as non-medical companions, essentially. And so I felt called to do that after the experience of the death of my father. And then, so I've been doing that for longer than I've been teaching death studies. And what I started to notice is that there was kind of a convergence between my experience doing palliative care and what I was teaching. And, you know, they were sort of both informing one another. And so over the years, I began to teach some of the modules for the volunteers with our local palliative care association. I started doing education workshops at our local residential hospice. And then I even worked on ways to get students involved through what we call community service learning. So having a section of the course where they would be doing an assignment in a practical, period of time working at the Palliative Care Association. So I was trying to bring those things together because at the same time, I was teaching a lot of nursing students. Those were the ones who were starting to come out of the woodwork and were the most interested in the death courses, obviously. That's changed and varied over the years. But so with that emphasis on nursing students, I realized that I should develop more courses that address more specifically some of the things. And so then I developed a second course, which was Death, Dying, and Spirituality. And in that course, I was trying to look at end-of-life care, but not just end-of-life care and the medical model that these students will face when they, begin their careers, but also some of the barriers and, sort of social justice issues related to end-of-life care. Yeah, so that's the short answer to that. I mean, I could keep going, but I'll stop there because that just gives you a sense of, how, because I think that's really important that the two things have been part of my experience teaching, and that they've informed one another. And that I think that, being someone who, actually is a companion to the dying has given me something that the students, I think, really benefit from in the classroom, that it's not all academic, right? But we have that other element to it.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think I'm absolutely fascinated to hear that personal side of like getting you into the study as well. And I think that probably has been so enriching for your students too, right? Coming into this. So I'm imagining that many of your students, they will be at the undergraduate level, right? So sort of like late teens, early 20s. And as we've had a conversation previously, have had experience in teaching on a module with similar age students.
Yeah.
So I was quite interested to hear your take on what you think it is that gets sort of a bunch of 20-something-year-olds to be interested in researching and learning about death and death studies. And what do you do to sort of keep them engaged once they've been hooked?
Right. Yeah. I mean, most of what I've learned about that I've discovered along the way, right? Like that it's often come by accident that I realize that this is something very compelling to them. So for instance, when I begin my class where we're talking about methods of disposition, bodily disposition, and I ask them, what do you want done with your body when you die? And, I get the two, burial, cremation, because those are the only ones they know, but they don't really know what they want. But they say that. And then when I teach a class and they learn about natural organic reduction and alkaline hydrolysis and all natural burial, then all of a sudden their minds are just blown. And so they, they suddenly realize that there's this whole area of things. And I would say that even, at parties or casual conversations with people, that's sometimes the biggest questions that people have and are most fascinated by. So like I said before, I really do think that living in a culture of a death phobia and death denial, which we invariably do, certainly in the context in which I'm teaching, that this is the norm. And I think that because of that, these young kids have experienced, in a sense, a silencing around things related to death. And so I have an assignment at the beginning of all of my courses, which is a death reflection. And I want them to introduce me to their experience with death thus far in their life. And even if they've had no experience of death personally, how they feel about it, what they think about it. It's a really compelling assignment. And I mean, they struggle with it, but I think they also find it really helpful. And over the years, what I have seen in those assignments is that their experience as young people, as children, right? So way before they've come to university, that they have had experiences of death or witnessed deaths or witnessed people grieving deaths like their parents. And the primary mode of handling that has been silence, not talking about it, protection, right? And certainly there's a whole body of research that I also teach in my courses about talking about death with children that is now saying, you know, we think we're protecting children, or we're avoiding them having anxiety about death by not talking about it. But it's very clear from the research that we're creating anxiety by not talking about it. And so in many ways, I think my students are the heirs of that way of approaching death with children, that's what they have lived through as young people. And so that that what they've described to me and what they write about is that this is very alienating and isolating. They have questions, they have fears, they have concerns, and they have no place for them. And so it's like when they come into this course, you know, they come in either intrigued or curious or, you know, a little bit, you know, sort of trepidatious about coming into a death course. And then they come into it, and then suddenly this whole space opens for them. And they see that there are people in the world who are researching death and talking about death, and that it's, you know, I introduce them to the death positive movement. And then suddenly, you know, all of those anxieties that they've had because of the silence around death, you know, I don't want to say they magically disappear, but they really do diminish. And I hear it again and again. There's no magic formula that I give them. There's no magic solution to this. They simply say that by having a space and having the opportunity to talk openly about death and ask their questions and voice their concerns and express their fears and their experience with death, that has significantly reduced their anxiety around death just by virtue of talking about it, right? I mean, it's so amazing to me that something as simple as having safe spaces for talking about death can change a young person's, whole, experience and demeanor around that. So like I said, I think that really I haven't done anything to draw them into that, but that when they have the space to come into it, that's when, sort of the interesting things happen. And then, one of the ways to answer the second part of your question about, sort of how I keep them engaged, we live in a small town here. It's, a small university where I teach. And so, they don't have a lot of exposure. There's not, places that they can go and visit on field trips. So I do use a lot of media. I take them virtually to an alkaline hydrolysis facility, through videos and things like that. And I use a lot of that kind of media, TED Talks, things like that, to draw them into the conversation. And also I started an Instagram account a few years ago that was sort of meant to chronicle my teaching, chronicle my students and things like that. But what has happened is that my students, have all sort of become part of that community. And so they've been introduced as well to a social media-based death community, right? Of funeral directors and podcasters and, death doulas. And I think that has also broadened their horizons and kept them engaged. One of their assignments one year was to create their own social media Instagram death account. And, this was, really quite a lot of fun for them. And I think they made connections with people in that community, which was amazing, really. Yeah.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. And it's so brilliant to hear as well, across the pond, getting so many students engaged and really talking about these really important topics. Just for obviously different universities work in different ways, I'm just quite intrigued as to how the modules that you've run do work. So have you got like lectures and maybe complimentary seminars, or I'm just very intrigued. I know from my experience, my students, I've been a teaching assistant, so led the seminars rather than the lectures, but the module that I've taught on, that it was really seemed to be in the seminars where the students like sort of were very forthcoming and sort of grew into the death studies world as the module went on. So yeah, I'd just love to hear like what
Yeah.
kind of engagement that the students get.
It's a great question, and it's interesting to make that comparison. So when I was a graduate student, because I was in a program that had masters and PhDs, the program had teaching assistants, right? So I did the same thing. You know, my professors were giving the lectures once a week, and I was doing the seminar. But because we don't have a graduate program where I teach, it's primarily an undergraduate. We have a few small graduate programs, but it's primarily an undergraduate university. So that means we don't have the ability to do that system. So I feel like what happened to me when I started teaching here is that I made my classroom both the lecture and the seminar, right? In a sense, that's what I've had to do. And because I had so much experience of that seminar type in, connection, I feel like it comes naturally to me in a way, right? And so, so we have a 12-week term for, like a 3-credit course. And in those 12 weeks, we have a 3-hour lecture per week. And so and that can be divided into 2 1.5s or 1 3-hour. And so whichever way I do it, I generally try to make the course include both lecture elements as well as discussion, watching video or things like that, or, some group work, things like that. And then we sort of do other kinds of things as well. When I'm teaching death cafes, we have a death cafe in the class and I get cake and, we do all those kinds of things. So, so really, I would say it's a mix. I don't know, is that answering your question in terms of how it works?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it was just, if the two were sort of separate, then I was wondering how the sort of students are then engaged, because that is one nuance that I've noticed just in my much more limited experience than yours, but that it seems to be in that more discussion type environment when they kind of really get their teeth into the topic and might be more willing to speak about their personal experiences and
Yes.
whatnot.
Yeah. I mean, it's a challenging thing, and I am comfortable with it. I know that most of my colleagues would be very uncomfortable with, teaching the material I teach because it's loaded, right? But so is religion. So I've been doing that for years, and that doesn't scare me anymore. So death is just another topic like that, right? And I'm very clear, and this must be also coming from my personal experience and my ability to be comfortable around difficult conversations and conversations about death and grief. And so I'll tell my students at the beginning of the course that this is challenging material, that it could be very provocative, and that's okay. And that if they feel particularly uncomfortable and they want to come and talk to me about it, I'm happy to do so, but it invariably happens, right? That death occurs while I'm teaching the course. Students lose family members, and what they continue to tell me over the years is that the course really helps them to navigate those personal experiences. And again, I think that's that sort of unique thing that comes together in my classes between both the theoretical and the practical experience around death and dying. And I guess I think it just creates an environment in which the students feel comfortable. I had a student who had lost her father a year before taking the class, and she came to me and said she wasn't sure. And, she left in one of the lectures, in tears. And so we talked through it, and I said, certainly if you feel like this is going to be too much, then maybe this isn't the time to be taking the course. And at the same time, she said, I think it's actually really good, and I think it's helping me. And I said, well, I'm not afraid of tears. So if you feel like you need to cry in the class, that's okay, right? Like, we don't need to make excuses for that. And so I think just having those open conversations that don't deny that the nature of the topic is going to be challenging and hard sometimes, seems to make for a really, good space, a good safe space to do that. We've had students die. I have had to walk into a classroom after one of my students was killed in a car accident. And, they come in and they're looking at me like, what do you got for us? And so in that instance, I gave a eulogy in the form of a lecture, or a lecture in the form of a eulogy, whichever way you want to do it. But and that's the realness, and that's the realness that they're craving, right? The counselors came in and all of that, and they're like, we don't want to talk to you. We need these kinds of conversations. So yeah, it's pretty profound.
Yeah, wow. That's truly beautiful. The fact that you've created these spaces too. I think often when we're researching these areas, it's quite easy to just be a bit blasé, isn't it, about the nature of the topic. And yeah, to have that realness there and really let the students appreciate it. I mean, you were saying you've obviously taught about like the death positivity movement and things like that too. And I think sometimes it's so good, well, and it's so necessary to stress that like death isn't necessarily it's not a good thing. We don't have to be celebratory or whatever about it.
Yes, yes.
And it's fine to be upset, right, that deaths happen, despite the fact that we're researching and like learning about all of these different sides to it. So I think that honestly, that's absolutely beautiful to hear that kind of like, yeah, eulogy form of a lecture as well.
It was really quite a moment. I just wanted to say one more thing about that, because I mean, and this is the way that I learn and the classes morph as I teach, and I sort of respond to what the students bring to me. And so what I realized over a number of years is that, and because I always ask them, what do you want to hear more of? What would you like to learn about? Things like that. And grief kept coming up. They wanted to talk about grief. And so, I feel ill-equipped. I'm not a therapist. I'm not, you know what I mean? I am, but I'm in that world. And I think that I know how to hold space because of my experience, accompanying the dying. And so I've started integrating articles and sections in the course on grief. And the response has been really profound and positive to that. And so I'm in the process of doing more training. And so I'm taking some new courses, and I want to take a course on especially focused on grief and children and young people. And, to sort of, I'll probably create a whole course on grief. I think that's what's coming to the surface now, is that there is a real desire on the part of the students to have open conversations about grief in the same way that they need to have open conversations about death. Because I would say probably, if you listen to someone like Megan Devine, who wrote It's Okay That You're Not Okay, in the same way we have a death denying society, we have a society that is also grief denying, right? We're supposed to get over it. We're supposed to be fine and not sort of dwell on it. And so I think having those conversations really has a positive effect on those same students who have had a kind of silencing around death and grief.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. Honestly, I want to move to your university and do all of these all of these courses. So you're in the religions and cultures department, right? So are most of your students from that same sort of course area? Or I know you mentioned you taught nursing students too. Is that a separate kind of subject topic to be explored? Or is that a separate course, or is it all sort of merged into one? Could you just reflect on that a little bit?
Sure. So the way it's set up, so all of the courses, so I teach two established courses in death studies, and then 2 new ones that I piloted this year that I'll probably turn into a regular course. I did them as topics courses. But those are all courses housed in the Religions and Cultures department, but they're open to all students. And so I can have a mix. So I have usually around 50 students in the second year courses and up to 80 in the first year course. And so they can come from any discipline. So I have historically had a lot of nursing students, but I'm noticing an increase in students from the professional programs. So in addition to nursing, I have social work students who are increasingly, the word is out, again, on questions of death and grief. This is going to be part of their practice. So social work students, and also criminal justice students. And so the stories are here because I ask every student, why are you taking this course? And, they'll say things like, I want to be a policeman or a policewoman. And I know I'm going to have to confront death. And so I thought it probably would be a good idea to take a course on death. And, the same with social workers, the same with nursing students. But then I also have, history students, English students, political science students, gender students, religion students, right? So it is really a mix, but the courses are open to everyone.
Yeah, and I suppose that shows just how much the topic must be fascinating. Like, it's wide reaching, isn't it, to draw in all of those different sort of disciplinary perspectives too. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, because there's clearly a demand there, rather than it just being from the religious studies side of things. But with that too, I know we mentioned briefly before, we both have backgrounds in religious studies, right? And I think often death studies can kind of seem to stem from that. Like the course that I've been teaching on at Durham is hosted by the theology and religion department. Obviously, the death studies courses that you're teaching are kind of hosted by the religions and culture department. So I'm interested in whether you think there's a link there, and maybe is there a fascination in terms of belief more generally, and then that linking in with death and funerals as to perhaps how we merge into it and have that as that kind of like theoretical
Yeah.
basis. Perhaps I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, you know, it's interesting. I'll just say first that when I was asked, you know, over the years to create a course for nursing students, like that would be part of the nursing program, specifically about palliative end-of-life care. And I've always resisted that. I want it to be a religions and cultures course, because I think that the discipline, like the humanities discipline that is religious studies, for me, is, you know, part of the human part of this course. When I gave a talk to the Nursing Society about this, the number one question that those students asked me was, you know, how do I talk to families? How do I, you know, help someone who is dying, right? They're not, you know, sort of physical kinds of questions. They're spiritual questions. They're interpersonal questions. And so I personally think that we need the humanities-based disciplines approaching death studies. Absolutely. I mean, we need the others too, but that's what I feel is my contribution in the university. But the course that I taught as a pilot last year was an intro to religious studies course on topics. And so my topic was death and the afterlife in world religions. And you know, you can teach world religions in many ways and from many perspectives. I've taught love, I've taught pilgrimage, right? So there are a lot of ways into introducing students to different religious ideas. But I think death has been the most successful version of introducing them because, you know, in some ways, I just begin the course with the question of mystery, which underpins all religious and spiritual, you know, sort of questioning and ideas. That notion of, you know, the unknown, and isn't death the great unknown, the great mystery? And so, you know, we begin with that question, you know, why has death been, you know, the most profound, you know, sort of human experience historically, religiously, spiritually? Why do we create ritual? Why do we, you know, have whole ethical systems, you know, developed in relation to the fact that we're mortal, you know? And so approaching death through religion, I think, has been really beneficial. And so a lot of the students who took that course, you know, were not religious. And, you know, many of them said to me that this was a really helpful introduction just to religion and spirituality through the concept of death, that it sort of broadened their ideas about what religion is about, as opposed to, you know, sort of more doctrinal ideas or ideological ideas that they might have encountered about religion, right? Because it was more from that perspective of seeking out meaning and trying to understand the meaning of life in the context of death. So it was really quite, well, it was just a fantastic class, actually. I really loved teaching it last year. And yeah, I want to do it again.
No, it's brilliant. And again, I think that is often, you know, where initial interest can be sparked. Like, I think what you were saying earlier about, you know, different means of handling the body after death. I mean, that's always going to be one route in. But I think fundamentally, as human beings, we all have our worldviews, don't we, about whatever it might be, something or other. And, you know, often people will say death, and what death involves is kind of the ultimate unknown, right? And so if you're trying to get students as a way in, thinking about how different perspectives, different worldviews think about death, I think is really key. So I completely agree with you, but I was yeah, fascinated to hear what you thought about that too, with us
Yeah.
both being in the sort of religious studies realm as well.
Yeah, it's something that I want to keep thinking about, right? I mean, I think I'm at the point now where I've been doing this for a long time, and things are starting to come together. I'm noticing patterns, and so I'm on sabbatical this year, so that's sort of one of the projects that I'm looking to write about is what does it mean to be teaching, death studies in the context of religious studies in a humanities-based discipline, especially when increasingly those humanities disciplines are under threat, right? And that we're moving in the direction, certainly, in my context here, in the direction of professional schools and training and things like that. And I think it's a good reminder of why we need the humanities, right? I think we don't just need them to live well, we need them to die well.
Yeah, perfectly said, actually, like you say, especially in the university context. And I'm not sure what everybody else in the room's background is, but I think it's the value of the humanities here is super important.
Yeah.
So I think there is a comment in the chat, but perhaps we can come to that in a few minutes. I just wanted to move back slightly to when we were talking about the kind of tools, educational tools that you use in the classroom to get students involved, regardless of obviously what degree or not they're doing. And particularly drawing on the practical experience that you described in your training as palliative care volunteer, and the different links perhaps that you have with funeral directors in the local community and whatnot. And if you could just reflect, maybe, I don't know, give a couple of examples. I know you spoke about the Instagram already and using YouTube or whatnot, but in perhaps just take one of your courses and think about 3 examples maybe of what you've done to really get the students engaged with those topics.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so maybe I'll pull from different courses in doing this, but in one course, which was the one where I had a lot of nursing students, so death, dying, and spirituality, I set up, we have these community service learning modules, which I mentioned before. So that is where students can, instead of an essay, go into the community for a certain number of hours and work with an organization, and then write up a report of their experience in doing that. And so I managed to, in one of my courses, have 4 students who worked at the Near North Palliative Care Association here in my town. And now they weren't working with people at end of life, of course. This is the one challenging thing about integrating students into palliative care, because there is a 10-week training process that has to happen before you're actually able to work with clients. You have to have police checks, and there's all kinds of things that have to happen. So that's kind of a bridge that is more of a long-term project to have something like that happen. But they did work with the association. It was more in the office and administratively, but they were part of it, and they were, sort of seeing how an organization like that functions. And I think many of them found it beneficial to have that community connection. I'm now trying to build some more connections or bridges, because we now have a residential hospice in our town to sort of get students there, and there might be a few more opportunities in the residential hospice that could be facilitated. So that's kind of in the works for me at the moment. When we were during the pandemic and we were in lockdown, so all of my classes reverted to online, of course. And so while I was teaching online, I had the opportunity to bring lots of people into my classes. And this was, just a wonderful thing that sort of happened, because we were in a situation where we were all locked into our own, rooms with our own computers. And so in the course of 2 of my classes, I invited the health justice activist, Dr. Nahid Dosani. He's a palliative care physician in Toronto, and he began a program working with the unhoused in the streets of Toronto who were at end of life, and basically started out by driving around in his Honda Civic helping folks who were dying in the streets. And he is just the most incredible and inspiring person imaginable. And he came to my class because he could online. And, you know, just having the opportunity for my students to meet someone like that and talk to him. I have had a number of students who were in nursing who have switched their area and have gone to work with his organization. It's called PEACH, which is palliative care. I can't remember the exact acronym, but his organization of working with folks in the streets of Toronto, and they've gone to work in that organization. You know, those kinds of connections, you know, I sort of facilitate, and then magical things happen. I've had a number of students who are working at the hospice, the residential hospice, who take my course. I had a podcaster, DS Moss, who does the adventures of Memento Mori, and he came to one of my classes. And so the students had to do an assignment, which was analyzing an episode of his podcast. And then he came into the classroom and we had this conversation. One last example of pandemic things that I did is I had a friend of mine who is from Mexico City. And so when I was teaching Day of the Dead to the students in one of our modules, she zoomed into the classroom and talked to the students about, you know, what it's like to be living in Mexico during the Day of the Dead, some of the practices, you know, sort of reflections on the spirituality of those practices, the connections to Halloween, things like that. And, you know, the students were delighted by that. It was really powerful to have that. And so now what's happened is that in the regular course of my classes, now we're back in the classroom. I still teach some of these courses online, but when I'm in the classroom, I just zoom them in to the real classroom and try and get people to join us. Because I really feel that, you know, I mean, I can't be the specialist of all things. And so a big part of the way I like to teach death studies is to allow students to experience, you know, people in the world doing this work. I'll give you one last example because it's a great one. I didn't want to forget it. When I teach the Death, Dying, and Spirituality course, which is looking at social justice issues at end-of-life care, one of the sections is on racism. And also we look at, so we look at racism sort of broadly, but we also look at specifically Indigenous spirituality and Indigenous end-of-life care. And so as a white settler, I don't necessarily feel like I should be the person talking about Indigenous spirituality and end-of-life care. So I have a colleague who is an Indigenous death doula who comes to the classroom. She also has established her own death doula training for Indigenous folks. That is, she's got a grant, and so it's free for them to do that. And she comes in and talks to the students, and you know, like that the value of that experience is just undeniable, and the students are profoundly touched by it. And you know, again, the nursing students, but not just the nursing students, really many of the students, you know, reach out to these people and have follow-up questions and are engaged by them. So yeah, those are some of the things that I do in the classroom that I think really have a powerful impact.
Yeah, it sounds absolutely brilliant. And it's funny, isn't it, what the pandemic kind of enabled, like facilitated, perhaps, which we might not have thought about beforehand, you know, having people virtually present rather than physically present, and the value that that can bring. But I think those practical tasks and sort of experiences that you're enabling your students to have as well are just absolutely brilliant, because otherwise, you know, it's very, well, it's still not easy, but it's easy to think about these things sort of in an abstract way, but to have that more practical side of things, I think is so valuable to,
Yeah.
well, life, because it's real, isn't it?
Exactly. So they read the research, they read the articles, they read the books, but then they also meet people who are in death work and engage with them through social media, through YouTube, through guest lectures. And I think that the bringing together of both of those things is really, really important.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'm still fascinated by your Death Ambassadors sort of
Ah,
movement, and the task as well that you said, you know, that you set for your students to go online and sort of set up their own death network. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So that was just one assignment where they had to create a death studies account. Now, some just did it. Some did a fictional account. I didn't require them to have an actual social media account if they didn't want to. So some just created a template, and they had to do a certain number of posts, and they had to tag people and use hashtags and all of that. But others created actual accounts. Some were dismantled afterwards, but a number of my students have kept their death accounts, which I think is really fantastic. But essentially, so that's an assignment element, but it's using social media. There have been other assignments where they have to analyze other social media accounts, like looking. I try to sort of vary it year to year and come up with different ideas, but I have had assignments where they either listen to podcasts or do analyses of podcasts, or they do an analysis of someone's social media account or a number of accounts. But the Death Ambassadors is, this happened probably about halfway through the past 20 years of teaching death studies, because I realized at the end of the course that my students had, a kind of newfound comfort with talking about death. They went home and they talked to their families, they talked to their friends, they had their own death cafes, right? So things were happening where I felt like my students were going out into the world and having conversations about death that, weren't being had otherwise. And so I said to them at the end of one of the classes, I said, I feel like, I need to anoint you or something, because you're going out in the world and you're changing the conversation around death. I teach them about death denial, and we look at the concept of death denial, and they've never heard of that before. But as soon as I tell them what it means, they know exactly what death denial is, right? Death denial is real. And then they start to recognize it in their own experiences, when they say something to their parents about the course, and their parents are like, oh, well, that's morbid, or don't talk about that. So they've had real experiences of death denial. And so, but then they push, they want to have more conversations. And so then I came up with this idea that they become death ambassadors. I mean, you can read that in weird ways, but it's turned out pretty cool. So then I designed a pin. It's probably maybe hard to see, but I designed a pin that says Death Ambassador. And then I had a whole bunch made. And so at the end of every class, I give them a pin, and they put them on their bags, they put them on their jackets. And I say, when someone says, hey, what's a death ambassador? You've just, allowed for an introductory conversation about death. And they happen. I had this great story that I shared on social media where one of my students was on the subway in Toronto, which is, 4 hours from here. And there was another student, previous student of mine, who had a Death Ambassador's pin on their bag, and they saw it and, had this great conversation, sent me a picture of their meeting. And so, when I started thinking about the fact that, if I'm teaching 2 death courses per term per year, and there's 50, so I'm teaching, say 200 students a year, and, giving them tools and, a sort of a newfound death awareness, I like to say. They're going out into the world with that death awareness. I can't change the conversation by myself, but I really feel like my students can and will. And so I just wanted to give it some name, some sort of tangible, thing that they could have as the opener for those kinds of conversations. Anyway, even when we were in the pandemic, I mailed them the pins. Like they love the pins, they want the pins, and they tell me that it often sparks conversations, and I think that's just great.
That's absolutely fascinating and so innovative too. And to have that label, I bet they're so proud of it because, like you say, you're equipping them to have these conversations. And I imagine if they reflected on how they felt at the beginning of the courses versus at the end, it's a remarkable amount of knowledge that is gained. That, as you say, I think compared with most people in society, is just then it's not comparable, really.
It's true. It's really true. I'm so proud of
movement.
Yeah, it is. It is a bit of a movement, a little tiny movement in Northern Ontario, but I'm very proud of them.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, I'm just looking at the chat, and we do have a comment from Elizabeth who's with us. I don't know, Elizabeth, if you feel comfortable maybe putting your camera on, if you have a question for Susan, or I can just go ahead and read your comment.
Hi, it's it's 6 o'clock in the morning, so I'm actually watching you from my bed, so I will not turn my camera
You don't
on.
have to, that's fine.
Completely acceptable. Well done for
But
making
yes,
it. Wow.
I'm a doctoral student at the University of Auckland, and yeah, my research is around conversations about death in primary schools and talking to teachers and also key informants like funeral directors, palliative care nurses, the Ministry of Education, and also Maori Kaumatua, so sort of the elderly, the wise within the Maori community, around whether they see conversations about death happening in classrooms, not because anyone is sick or anyone's died, but actually having those conversations ahead of time, so to speak. So yeah, feeling really privileged to be doing this research. And certainly the majority of teachers do feel they have a place to have those conversations after the family, after the whānau. And yeah, just interested in your thoughts, both your thoughts around those conversations within the primary class setting, I suppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And that's amazing research. I'm so delighted to hear that you're working on that. It sounds wonderful. And I think so too. So I'll just, for context, Nipissing University is really well known as a teaching school. So we have an education program there, and we make a lot of teachers, train a lot of teachers. And so a lot of my students are actually going to be teachers, and this has come up before, right? They've asked about this. And I'll just give you an interesting example about this, because I think there's some feeling like, you know, the adults in university can handle talking about death, but do we really want to do it with the younger kids, you know?
Yes.
And so I did a guest lecture in one of my colleagues' classes in English studies, and it was a picture book class. And so I came in with some deaf kids' picture books and read them and talked to them about that, and did a little lecture on, you know, teaching children about death through picture books. And we got into a conversation because, of course, most of these students were going to be teachers, and they were a bit divided about this. So they recognized that this would be really good to have these conversations, and the books that I was using were fantastic. But they had this hesitation, thinking that, you know, maybe this isn't the role of the teacher. Maybe teachers shouldn't be talking about death, that should be something that the parents do. It was not all of them, but there was a really interesting divide, you know, kind of like religion, you know, oh, well, we shouldn't be teaching religion to these kids. We should let that be the parents' prerogative.
And it is fascinating. I do relief teaching sort of on the side to bring money in. And yes, a teacher had said, could the children write about their father or their grandfather? And a 6-year-old boy said, well, I can't write about my grandfather because he's died. So that whole already in their mind are things that sort of can be written about and can't be written about. And I said, well, of course you can. I'm just about to model the writing about my dad, and he's died, but I still have memories of him. So yeah, so it is absolutely fascinating. And I think, as you say, picture books could be a great way in. And also here in New Zealand, we have Matariki, which is the Maori New Year. And there are a number of stars that are the focus of that. And one is Pohutukawa, which is remembering the people who have died in the last year. And we've just recently had Matariki made a public holiday. And it is really interesting to see that that schools are beginning to use that Matariki and those different stars, including Pohutukawa. So I feel that if that is each year brought into the curriculum, it's going to be fabulous, in my opinion.
That is great. I love hearing that. That's amazing. And, you know, I mean, the picture books I think are ideal, because whenever, you know, I've sort of just become the person in the community that people reach out to when there's a death. And so when a number of people have been coming to me recently about their kids experience a death, whether it's a parent, a grandparent, an animal, and I give them books, right? Like,
Yeah.
because I want to empower the parents to have I don't want to be the one coming in and saying, let's have a talk about death. But with the picture books, the parents themselves can have those conversations, right? Which is overcoming that silence that we typically use.
So thank you, Susan. Thank you for,
oh, my pleasure.
this morning for me, but thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, we're all in different time zones, probably at this point. That is brilliant. Oh, Jennifer, would you like to chip in?
Hi there. I don't know if you can hear me. Ooh,
Yes.
I have taken the risk of turning my camera on, and Elizabeth, I think I should have stuck with I should have said that I was still asleep too, but it's evening time here in Ireland. So I really loved your presentation, and thank you to ASDS for, I think probably everybody who's involved in ASDS in some ways involved in death education, whether we're postgrad students ourselves, or we're teaching, or we're community educators, or whatever it is. But it's lovely to kind of step back from it and have a little reflection on it. And I suppose what I'm wondering is actually, Susan, I hope we can get in touch in some way. Some of our teaching and our teaching approaches sound really similar. And I do a couple of modules here in Ireland in social sciences with social care students, which would sort of be like human service workers. It would be that similar to almost like assistant social work. And then also psychology undergrad students, right? The difference here is that there's very few elective spaces.
Yes, it's the same here.
Okay.
It is the same.
So I suppose what I'm saying is, like, you can't really opt out of my class that I teach because it's part of a required set. So do you ever come across students who are very reluctant to start something, or feel like this shouldn't be taught, we shouldn't have this in here, it's too much, it's not the right time in our degree? I find every once in a while, out of 100 students, I'll get 2. The vast majority are very willing to kind of engage with the material, especially if they know it's going to be safe and not super emotionally demanding, or that I try to leave things open. But every once in a while, I'll get a couple of people, and I certainly sometimes get kickback from colleagues or from people in managerial level who do not agree that this should be
that you should be that death studies should be part of it. Wow.
Yeah, would find it a little bit macabre or ghoulish, or even though I'm not that way at all, that's not how I present, that's not my thing, that's not where I'm coming from, it's not Halloween, at all. So do you ever encounter that?
It's an interesting question. I mean, because I don't teach a required module, so I think it's different in that regard, right? What you're doing is part of their degree, so they have to take it. So they only take my classes as electives. They're only electives. So they're generally willing participants because they have chosen it. But it is true that they have very few. I have had my nursing students say that this should be a mandatory course for all nurses, because increasingly what I'm hearing from my nursing students, and we have a great nursing program, and I really don't want to say anything bad about it, but my students who are in nursing say to me that the only thing they've learned about death is how to bag a body, right? And they're going to be encountering death. And so even the idea of, so I've had nursing faculty say things to me like, oh yeah, we need to have more palliative care, but it's not just about palliative care in nursing, right? I have students who want to work in NICU, who want to work in the emergency department. They're going to be dealing with catastrophic traumatic death. And, I personally think that if they don't have any experience in thinking about death and their own mortality and all of these things, that they're going to really struggle when that happens, and it's going to be harder for them, but other than that, I haven't had any kind of pushback. I think that there's, there seems to be a lot of support for the death courses, I mean, they're popular. And I think that I'm trying to develop a minor in death studies right now that's interdisciplinary with my colleagues in anthropology and English and gender and history. So generally from administration, I've had a lot of support, but I do sense a tension sometimes with the professional programs, because I know that, you know, my students are saying in the nursing program that are taking my classes, we need more of this. And I don't want that to come across to the nursing program that the program's deficient, but I agree with them. I think it is important,
that it's threatening,
you know?
in some way. Yeah. It's so funny. And there's so much talk and conversation about like, oh, med students need this, nurses need this, even occupational therapists and speech and language and psychologists, you know, they need this. But yet there is, other than the almost tokenistic, like 1 or 2 lectures, there is not a drive to make this a significant component of a degree program that I can see here in Ireland anyway.
Same here. Jennifer, if there is a dream of mine, it is to get into medical and nursing training with death studies. That is, you know, that's the big picture goal, you know, in some sense. I'm doing it in this small scale, but I think that that is the key, because you listen to, even if you listen to all of the palliative care, great palliative care docs who are out there now doing TED Talks, you know, Sunita Puri and Nahid Dasani and others like that, you know, they're all saying that this, you know, we need to get better at death, and they're trying to show the ways in which we can have better care, you know, by being less death phobic and more death aware. And yet at the same time, and acknowledging that they don't get trained any of that in their medical training. So it is out there. Ira Biox, another one who came to mind, right? So they're all saying that, and yet nothing's happening. No one's doing anything about it.
Yeah.
You know? But yeah, I'd absolutely love to stay in touch. So
great. Okay. Thank you. Excellent talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks so much for sharing that too. So I think having all of the different perspectives, like you said, Jennifer, I think everyone involved in ASDS, like we're all sort of pushing this from one side or another in what we're doing. But I mean, I for one, am so grateful for everything that you shared today, Susan. I think your courses sound absolutely brilliant. And the different ways that you're coming into all of this. So I think we just need to sprinkle a bit of that around the world, and then maybe we'll get better at these kinds of things. But yeah, little pockets going on all over the shop. But really, to get this, it's a movement. Maybe we all need to be death ambassadors. Forget the death positivity movement. we'll
join the death ambassador movement. Yeah.
But I mean, the time is just flown. We are actually at 1:30 now, so I'm conscious of everybody's days, whether they be early, middle, or late of the day. So
exactly.
Probably should wrap up. But yeah, I am honestly so grateful for you joining us and for sharing all of your insights from the last 20 or so years in the field. And yeah, is there anything you'd like to say as a final word?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you for being here and just for having this conversation, and for your interest and engagement, and for whoever's watching this recording, the same thing, because for me, it's just delightful to just be connecting. And I'm so glad that you and I connected, and that I became a member of ASDS and have sort of joined this larger network of folks who are interested in death education. So I'm just delighted to be part of these connections, and I hope that we can continue them.